The record had a scratch in it. That was the first thing archivist Thessaly Vor noticed. Not the content, not the timestamp, not the 17 layers of authentication protocol that should have flagged the file before it ever reached her terminal. Just a scratch. A half-second of audio degradation buried inside a diplomatic transmission from the human delegation, right at the moment their representative stopped speaking and the council chamber fell silent. She played it again. The scratch was still there. And in 26 years of archival work, Thessaly Vor had never once seen a transmission from a Tier 1 civilization arrive with corrupted audio. The Gret Holly encoded in redundant crystalline arrays. The Voth-Scenari used quantum-paired relays. Even the chorus, ancient, distributed, barely comprehensible delivered communications in perfect fidelity across 11,000 light-years. The humans had sent their most important diplomatic message of the century on a channel with a scratch in it. She flagged the file and moved on. There were larger things to worry about. She had no way of knowing the scratch was the only honest thing in the entire transmission. The vote had been scheduled for the 14th rotation of the conclave season, which in human terms corresponded to a Tuesday in March. A fact that the human delegation had noted in their official response with a kind of flat, bureaucratic acknowledgement that the council's senior translator, a Gret Holly named Voth-Samarin, found quietly unsettling. Not because the humans were displeased, because they weren't. Every species Voth-Samarin had ever worked with, and he had worked with 41, over a career spanning 6 decades, reacted to the scheduled vote with some form of visible anxiety. The Voth-Scenari had trembled in their outer membranes for 3 rotations before their admission hearing. The Kaloon Collective had sent 17 preemptive diplomatic gifts. Even the machine intelligences of the Shattered Choir, who technically had no nervous system to speak of, had submitted 42,000 pages of supplemental documentation in the final hours before judgment. The humans had submitted a single document, 14 pages, 12 of which were what their representative, a woman named Commander Adrian Solis, had described to Voth-Samarin as background reading if you have time. Do you understand what this vote determines? Voth-Samarin had asked her the day before the session. Solis had looked at him, really looked, in that particular human way that always made him feel like something was being measured, and said, "Yes." Just that, one word, and then she had returned to reading a paper document, an actual physical paper document that appeared to have coffee stains on it. He had not known what coffee was then. He did now. He wished he still didn't. The vote, when it came, was not close. 43 member species of the Galactic Council, 39 votes against Earth's application for full membership, 3 abstentions, 1 vote in favor from the Drevathi, a reclusive species of deep ocean chemosynthetics who had only spoken to the Council 12 times in their entire membership history, and whose vote had surprised everyone, including, visibly, the humans. Solis had looked at the Drevathi representative for a long moment. Then she had written something in her paper document. The Council's presiding chair, a towering Gret Holly elder named Councillor Marin Seth, had delivered the judgment with what Thessaly Vor would later describe in her archive as appropriate procedural gravity, which was a diplomatic way of saying that the counselor had smiled. Humanity's application is denied, Marin Seth had said. The Council finds that the applicant species has not demonstrated the cognitive, cultural, or strategic maturity required for full galactic participation. The Council further recommends a reassessment period of no fewer than 200 standard years, during which humanity is encouraged to develop the institutional frameworks appropriate to its current developmental stage. Laughter, or the nearest equivalent, had rippled through 17 of the 43 delegations. Solis had not reacted. She had closed her paper document, folded her hands on the table, and said very quietly into the open channel, "Thank you for your time." Then she had left. The council had not understood then that she had not said goodbye. Samarin found her in the corridor outside the chamber. He had not intended to follow her. He had simply found his feet moving in her direction, which he had attributed to professional curiosity and later, in his memoir, revised to something he could not name precisely, but which translated roughly as * the feeling you get when you are watching a fire that has not yet decided what it will burn. Commander Solis. She stopped, turned. I wanted to offer, he paused. He wasn't sure what he wanted to offer. I wanted to say that I believe the council's decision was. You don't have to explain it, she said. I understood the decision. You are not angry. She tilted her head slightly. Of course I'm angry. He studied her face. Her expression had not changed. You don't appear angry. No, she agreed, I don't. He stood with that for a moment. What will you do now? Adrian Solis looked at him for the third time with that particular quality of attention, and he felt, again, that something was being evaluated, not him specifically, but something through him, something he was adjacent to without understanding. We're going to go home, she said, and we're going to get to work. She walked away. He did not ask what work. He would spend the next 3 years wishing he had. The first sign came 18 months later, and it did not look like a sign. The deep-range monitoring station Samarin had never thought much about, a routine gravitational wave relay positioned at the edge of human-claimed space, primarily notable for its exceptional boredom, began returning anomalous readings. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that triggered automated alerts or brought analysts running. Just a subtle, persistent deviation in the background gravitational signature of the Sol system that the station's algorithms initially categorized as sensor drift and flagged for routine maintenance review. 3 weeks later, a second station, positioned on the opposite side of the human territory, returned similar readings. HFY War received both reports. She filed them. She moved on. Sensor drift was not unusual in boundary zones. She did not notice that the two anomalies were positioned in perfect geometric relationship to a third point that did not contain any monitoring equipment, because there had never been any reason to position monitoring equipment there. 6 months after that, the Gret Holly Long-Range Observation Network, which was not, officially, a surveillance system, because official surveillance of applicant species was prohibited under Council Charter, returned imagery from the Sol system that showed something no one had predicted. Construction. Massive, rapid, geometrically precise construction spread across 17 separate locations in the system simultaneously, ranging from the asteroid belt to the outer Kuiper boundary. The analyst who first reviewed the imagery submitted his report with a notation that said simply, "This does not correspond to any known human construction template," requesting senior review. Senior review took 4 days. By the time it was completed, the construction had progressed by a factor that a junior analyst calculated, and then calculated again, and then quietly stopped calculating because the number looked wrong. Counselor Marin Seth was briefed on a Thursday, another human weekday designation, that was making its way into council records with irritating frequency. "What are they building?" she asked. "We don't know," said her intelligence advisor. "What does it look like?" A long pause. "It doesn't look like anything we have a category for." Marin Seth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Increase monitoring frequency, and find me someone who has actually spoken to the humans recently." The only name that appeared was Samarin. He had tried to contact Solis twice in the 18 months since the vote, once through official channels, which returned an automated acknowledgement and nothing further, once through what he had naively thought was an informal back channel, which had returned the same automated acknowledgement, word for word, leading him to conclude that the humans had arranged their diplomatic silence with considerable care. The third attempt, this time at the Council's formal request, returned something different, not a response from Solis. A response from someone he had never heard of, Deputy Coordinator Yale Marcus, Office of External Relations, Earth Consolidated Authority. The message was 8 words long. Commander Solis is not available. How may I help? Voss Samarin had stared at those 8 words for a long time, not at what they said, at what they implied. Commander Solis. 8 months ago she had been Representative Solis. The humans had, at some point in the interim, given her a different title. They had made their diplomat a commander. He wrote back immediately. We would like to discuss recent construction activity in your system. We would like to arrange a meeting. The response came in 40 minutes. We'll let you know when we're ready. Ready, as it turned out, meant 14 months. 14 months during which the monitoring reports became increasingly difficult to categorize, and the senior analyst's language became increasingly hedged, and Counselor Marin Seth's briefing sessions became increasingly tense. 14 months during which 3 separate delegations within the Council proposed formal resolutions demanding human compliance with monitoring protocols, and all 3 failed to achieve quorum because nobody could agree on whether the protocols technically applied, since humanity was not, after all, a member. 14 months during which the anomalous gravitational readings did not stop. They grew, slowly, consistently, without drama. Whatever the humans were building, it was getting heavier. Then, on a morning that Thessaly Vor would later mark in her personal records with a notation she'd never used before, a small, private symbol that translated, roughly, as asterisk, this is where things changed. A transmission arrived from the Sol system. Not through the standard diplomatic channel. Through the gravitational wave relay network. The humans had sent their message on the Council's own infrastructure, using a modulation technique that the relay system's automated processors initially rejected as noise before routing it anyway because the content was flagged. By what protocol? No one could immediately determine, as priority 1. The message was from Commander Adrian Solis. It was 47 seconds long. Galactic Council. This is Commander Solis of the Earth Consolidated Authority. We've been getting to work. We think it's time you saw what we've been building. We're extending an invitation for a delegation of observers to visit the Sol system at a time of your choosing, within the next 30 standard days. After 30 days, the invitation expires. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. We'd recommend you come. The transmission ended. Voss Amarin listened to it 6 times. On the 6th listen, he noticed something he had missed on the first 5. In the 2-second pause at the end, before the transmission closed, there was a sound. A very faint sound. It took him 3 hours to identify it. It was laughter. The delegation was assembled in 11 days. Marin Seth had wanted to refuse. Her intelligence advisor had spent 40 minutes explaining why acceptance was the only rational choice. Voss Samarin, who had not been invited to that meeting but had heard the summary, had thought, she already knows that. She just wanted someone to tell her she was wrong. She was hoping someone could. No one could. The delegation consisted of 7 representatives, including Marin Seth, Voss Samarin in his capacity as senior translator, and, in a decision that had caused significant internal debate, 1 representative each from the Dravathi and the Kalun Collective. The former because they had voted in favor of human membership and might have context the others lacked. The latter because the Kalun were the most technologically sophisticated species in the Council and might be able to identify what the humans had built. The Kalun representative's name was Synthesis Jorah. She was brought in from a research posting at the edge of the Kalun home cluster, reportedly because she was the best, and reportedly because she had asked to come. On the transit ship, Voss Amarin sat beside her. "Have you read the construction reports?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What did you make of them?" She was quiet for a long moment. The stars moved past the viewport in their slow, indifferent way. "I made nothing of them," she said finally. "That's what concerns me." They arrived in the Sol system on day 19. Nothing at first looked different. The star was where it had always been. The third planet, blue-white, clouded, orbited by its single pale moon, sat in its familiar position. The asteroid belt was where it had always been. The outer planets maintained their expected rotations. And then the Kalun navigational array, equipment that could resolve a structure the size of a modest building from 3 light-years away, finished its initial sweep, and Synthesis Jorah said nothing for 11 seconds, and then said, in a tone Voss Amarin had never heard from a Kalun before, "That isn't possible." He looked at her readout. He looked for a long time. The humans had built a ring, not a space station, not an orbital platform, not anything that fit any category in the Council's technical lexicon. A ring, circumferential, positioned at the inner boundary of the asteroid belt. In cross-section, it was hollow, a tunnel, essentially, wide enough that the Gret Holly homeworld could have fit inside with room remaining, running in an unbroken loop around the entire inner solar system. And it was moving. Not in the way that orbiting structures moved. It was rotating around its own axis, the entire structure, at a rate that Jorah's instruments confirmed and her comprehension refused. "How long have they been building this?" Marin Seth asked. 18 months, Jorah said. Silence. "That is not possible," Marin Seth said. "No," Jorah agreed, "it isn't." A communication request came in before anyone had finished processing what they were seeing. "Solis." Voss Amarin accepted it. She appeared on the screen, same face, same flat evaluating attention, but something was different. It took him a moment to identify it. She was tired. Not the performance of tiredness, not the metaphor of it. Actually, physically, profoundly tired. The kind of tired that had been present so long it had stopped being a temporary state and become a permanent feature, the way scars became permanent features. He had seen that particular quality of exhaustion once before, in recordings from a species that had survived a siege that lasted 90 standard years. "Welcome to the Sol system," Solis said. "I know it looks different." "What is it?" Marin Seth asked, her voice doing something that Voss Amarin had not heard it do in 30 years of knowing her. It was the voice of someone who had just realized the ground was less solid than previously believed. Solis smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "That depends on what you mean by what." "Then let's start with how," Jorah said. She leaned forward. "Synthesis Jorah, Kalun Collective. That structure cannot have been built in 18 months. It cannot have been built in 18 decades by any known method of." "We know," Solis said. "Then how?" "Synthesist." Solis said the word gently but precisely, the way you might stop someone from stepping on something that would break. "We'll explain. We want to explain. That's why we invited you, but I need you to understand something first." A pause. "The ring isn't what we invited you here to see." Voss Amarin thought about that sentence for the rest of his life. It wasn't the words that stayed with him. It was the timing, the specific placement of that revelation, at the exact moment when the Council delegation had all simultaneously concluded that the ring was the single most significant thing they had ever seen, and the equanimity with which Solis delivered the correction. Not gloating, not performing, simply redirecting. Like someone who has set out a decoy long enough to be sure you've looked at it. The delegation was transported to a human facility, positioned at what their navigational charts listed as an empty coordinate inside the ring's interior. A point in space that their sensors had, until 30 seconds before docking, confirmed was empty. It was not empty. The structure they docked with was smaller than the ring by every objective measure, and yet as soon as the airlock completed its seal, and the delegation moved through into the interior, Samarin had the overwhelming and disorienting conviction that he had walked into something larger than what he'd approached from the outside. That was the moment he understood that something was wrong with his assumptions. It would take another 4 hours for him to begin to understand what. Solis met them in a chamber that was, deliberately, comfortable, human comfortable, which meant slightly too warm, slightly too bright, and furnished with objects that served no obvious function, including a collection of plants that had no business growing in space. She sat on one side of a table. The delegation sat on the other. On the table between them she set a small device, cylindrical, unadorned, the size of a fist. 14 months ago, she said, we told you we'd let you know when we were ready. Yes, Marinseth said. We're ready. Marinseth's composure, decades of diplomatic training, constitutional imperviousness, cracked slightly at the edges. Ready for what? Solis pressed a single button on the cylindrical device. Nothing happened, visibly, but the navigational instruments that Jorah was quietly running on her personal unit emitted a small chime. Jorah looked at her readout. That's, she said, and stopped. Tell me, Marinseth said. Jorah looked up. Her 6 eyes met Marinseth's. That signal just arrived at the outer sensor boundary of Kaloon space, she said, simultaneously, from 12 different directions. That would require, Marinseth began. 12 relay points, Solis said. Yes. You don't have 12 relay points. We didn't, Solis said, 18 months ago. The room was very quiet. The ring isn't a structure, Jorah said slowly. It's a transmitter. It's a component, Solis said, and the precision of that word landed in the chamber like something dropped from a height. Not a transmitter. A asterisk component asterisk, part of something larger. What you're not seeing yet is everything outside this system it connects to. Marinseth's voice had completely flattened, stripped of all effect. What is outside this system? Solis looked at her with that particular quality of human attention, the kind that measured without revealing what it measured, and said, that depends on what you decide in the next 30 days. The 47 hours that followed were, in Samarin's professional estimation, the most densely consequential period in Council diplomatic history, and also the period during which he understood the least about what was actually happening, which he would later identify as not being a coincidence. The humans showed them things, carefully curated, precisely sequenced things, walked through in an order that he would later recognize was not random, and was not incidental. They showed them the ring's internal mechanics, extraordinary, yes, unlike anything in the Kaloon's engineering database, but explicable if you allowed certain assumptions about human manufacturing capacity that were uncomfortable to allow. They showed them a network of smaller relay structures distributed across the outer system, also extraordinary, also explicable, if you allowed those same uncomfortable assumptions further latitude. They did not show them what the network connected to. They showed them population figures. Human population had grown, substantially, in the 18 months since the vote, not through biological reproduction. Something else. Something that Samarin noticed was never directly explained despite being repeatedly gestured toward. How many of you are there now? He asked, during a break in the formal presentations, while Solis was reviewing something on her paper document. She didn't look up immediately. Enough, she said. That is not a number. She looked up then. No, she agreed, it isn't. He waited. Samarin, she set down the document. Why did the council vote the way they did? He considered a diplomatic answer, set it aside. Because you were considered too young, too volatile, too Small, she said, too small. In certain respects. We're not small anymore, she said. That's the part the council needs to understand, not the ring, not the network, the number. Tell me the number. A pause, longer than it should have been. We will, she said, when the time is right. He went back to his quarters with the strong conviction that the humans were not withholding information because they didn't trust him. They were withholding it because releasing it prematurely would produce a response they did not want, and they had thought very carefully about what response they did want. They were managing the disclosure the way you managed a load-bearing wall, carefully, in sequence, because if you removed too much at once, the whole structure came down. He lay in the dark and thought about the laughter in the transmission, the 2-second pause, the sound he had spent 3 hours identifying. What was she laughing at? Him, the council, the situation? Or had she simply, in the moment after delivering her message, heard something inside the room behind her, something about what they had built, some specific fact or figure, and been unable to suppress the reaction? He did not sleep. The formal review session reconvened on the second day. Marin Seth opened it. We have reviewed the materials provided, she said, and we have a number of questions. Of course, Soli said. The construction timeline is accurate, Soli said. It cannot be accurate, our synthesist cannot account for it using existing frameworks, Soli said. I know. We're aware the timeline looks impossible. We're also aware that you've been running your own numbers since yesterday and that you can't find the error because there isn't one. Jorah was very still. How, she asked. And Soli said something that Samarin would replay, as Thessaly Vor had replayed that scratched transmission many times in the years that followed. We decided we couldn't afford for it to be impossible, Soli said. So we stopped treating it as impossible and started treating it as hard. Those are different categories. Jorah's 6 eyes blinked in sequence. That is not an engineering explanation. No, Solis agreed. It's a human one. It was on the 3rd day that the actual strike happened. Not a weapon, not a battle. The word strike would be contested in the historical record for decades, and eventually settled upon not because it was perfect but because no better word existed for what the humans did. At the opening of the 3rd day's session, Solis placed a second object on the table beside the cylinder. It was the scratched diplomatic transmission, the original recording, physical media. Samarin recognized it instantly. He had filed that report himself. We know you've been watching us, Solis said, looking at Marin Seth with a directness that was, by council diplomatic standards, extraordinarily impolite and did not appear to be accidental. Since before the vote, since before we applied, we know about the network. We know the positions of the monitoring stations, including the ones established in violation of the Charter's boundary zone provisions. We have a full mapping. The room went very quiet. I want to be clear, Solis said. We're not angry about the monitoring. Monitoring is rational. We would have done it too. What I want the council to understand is what the monitoring showed you, and what it failed to show you, and why the gap between those two things is what you should be frightened of. She opened her paper document, set it on the table, turned it around. It was a list, annotated in handwriting dense and precise, covering multiple pages. Samarin could read enough of the notation style to understand its general structure: locations, dates, signatures, cross-references. It was a record of every intelligence-gathering operation the Council had run against Earth in the past 3 years. You saw the ring, Solis said. You didn't see what the ring enabled. You saw the relay network. You didn't see what the network carried. You saw our construction timeline and called it impossible. She paused. You didn't ask who was doing the building. Jorah's voice was very flat. Who was doing the building? Solis met her eyes. Everyone, she said. Another pause, this one absolute. We have been a species of 8 billion people for most of our recorded history, Solis said. Give or take. The Council's demographic models extrapolated from that figure, standard growth curves, reasonable assumptions. She tapped the document. Your most recent intelligence placed our population at 9.2 billion. We're aware that's from the survey conducted approximately 13 months ago. Marin Seth said nothing. Current figure, Solis said, is 41 billion. Nothing moved in the room. The ring isn't a transmitter, Solis continued. It's the first completed segment of a transit infrastructure. The relay network is already carrying traffic, has been for 6 months. We have established 11 permanent habitation zones outside the Sol system in that time. Our expansion rate is currently, she glanced at the document, 11 new sites per standard month. Jorah made a sound, not a word, a sound. At current rate, Solis said, looking at Marin Seth with that level, exhausted, inexorably patient attention, we will have presence in 412 star systems within 20 standard years. A pause. We're not asking for membership anymore. The silence after that statement had a different quality than all the silences before it. Then what are you asking? Marin Seth said very quietly. We're asking the Council to decide, Solis said, whether it wants to be part of what comes next, or whether it would prefer to watch. It was Voss Samarin who spoke next, because someone had to, and because he had spent 3 days understanding, in accumulating and terrifying increments, something that he could not have articulated before this moment. How long, he said. Solis turned to him. How long have you been planning this? And the answer she gave was the one that broke everything open. Since before we applied, she said, the application was never about membership. He stared at her. Then what was it about? She looked at him, that same quality of attention, measuring something through him, and then for the first time he understood what she was measuring, not him, not the Council, not their capabilities or their response. She was measuring whether they were ready to hear the truth. She had been making that evaluation since the first moment they met. The 14 pages, the coffee stains, the single word yes, when he asked if she understood what the vote meant, the laughter in the transmission, the 30-day deadline, the sequencing of everything they had been shown, every reveal calibrated, every withheld fact placed precisely in the order that would produce the specific understanding she needed them to reach. The application for membership had been a test. Not of humanity. Of the Council. The application was reconnaissance, he said, not asking, statting. We needed to understand how the Council made decisions, Solis said, what criteria mattered, what it would take to be taken seriously, and whether, a pause, very brief, it was worth taking seriously in return. She closed the paper document. The vote told us everything we needed to know. And what did it tell you? His voice came out differently than he intended, smaller. Adrian Solis looked at him for the last time with that particular quality of attention, and for the first time, he saw something behind it. Past the exhaustion, past the control, past the extraordinary patience. Something that was not anger and was not satisfaction and was not pride. It was grief, a very specific kind of grief, the kind reserved for outcomes that were expected and hoped against and arrived anyway. It told us we were on our own, she said, so we got to work. The documents were signed 17 days later. Not a membership application, a partnership framework, a new category of relationship for which the Council had no prior template and was required to invent one. 41 billion humans across 11 systems, expanding at a rate that made projections an act of imagination, infrastructure that the Kowloon could not fully account for. A transit network that was, by the time the framework was finalized, already carrying its 4 millionth passenger. Thessaly Vor archived all of it. She found the scratch in the original transmission 2 years later while compiling the historical record. She listened to it 17 times. She consulted 3 audio specialists, 2 signal engineers, and 1 human technician who had been assigned to the archival office as part of the new cultural exchange protocol. The technician listened once and said, "That's not corruption." Thessaly Vor looked at him. "What is it?" "That's an edit," he said. "Someone removed something." "What was there?" He shrugged, a gesture she had learned to read as asterisk, "I don't know, but I'm not particularly concerned," asterisk, which was a human combination she had never encountered in any other species. "Can't tell from the residue. Something short. A word, maybe 2. She thought about Solis, about the 2-second pause, about the laughter. "Could it have been laughter?" she asked. The technician considered. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it could have been." She looked at the file, at the scratch, at the deliberately corrupted record of the moment humanity had, in hindsight, already decided everything. They had edited the laughter out, not to hide it. If they'd wanted to hide it, they would have removed it cleanly and no one would have found the gap. They had left the scratch, left the evidence of the edit deliberately. They had wanted someone to find it eventually, to know it had been there, to wonder what it meant and feel the shape of what was missing without being able to fill it in. She sat with that for a long time. Then she filed the report, locked the archival record, and wrote in her own notation at the bottom of the file, in a script only she could read. "They were already laughing when they walked into that chamber. They knew how we would vote before we voted, and they let us think we were judging them." She paused, added one more line. "We never understood that the application was the first strike. We thought the strike came after. We were counting from the wrong moment. They were counting from before we ever knew there was a count." The archive closed. Outside, the relay network hummed 11 systems, then 17, then 26, carrying its millions of passengers between the stars on infrastructure that should have taken centuries and had taken months, built by a species the galaxy had looked at and found small, found volatile, found unready, found unserious. A species that had, in the 2 seconds of silence at the end of a diplomatic transmission, already decided it did not need permission. A species that had walked into its own rejection, noted the exact angle and velocity of the door as it closed, and immediately begun building the road that went around it. Vas Amarin lived long enough to see 431 human-established systems, long enough to see the Council adopt the partnership framework as the model for 3 other new contact situations, long enough to watch the Galactic Council, ancient, vast, confident in its centuries of continuity, begin, subtly and incrementally, to accommodate a species that had declined to accommodate itself. On his last day at the office, he took out his own records of that first corridor conversation, the one where he had asked Solis what she would do, and she had said, "We're going to go home and get to work." He had written at the time, "I did not ask what work." Below that, in handwriting that had aged alongside him, was a note he had added later. "It would not have mattered. She would have told me the truth. I wouldn't have believed it." He sat for a long time with the record open. The truth, in hindsight, was this. The Galactic Council had mocked humanity in a chamber designed to make species feel small, had delivered its judgment with smiles that fell just short of laughter, had given 200 years as the timeline for humanity to become worth considering. Humanity had looked at 200 years and decided, with a particular irrational and absolute commitment that made them genuinely unlike anything the galaxy had produced, that 200 years was simply not a number they were going to accept. Not out of anger, not out of pride. Out of the same quiet, inexhaustible, slightly terrifying resolve that Solis had carried in a single word, yes, when asked if she understood what the vote meant. They had understood exactly what it meant. They had simply decided it meant something different to them. That was the thing the galaxy kept failing to account for, that humanity did not experience closed doors as endings. They experienced them as information, data points, measurements of the distance between where they were and where they intended to be. The door that closed in that chamber had told them the precise size and shape of what they needed to build. So they went home and they built it. And somewhere in the archive, in a file with a scratch in it, there was still the shape of the laughter that had preceded all of it, the sound of a species that had walked in knowing and walked out certain, and said thank you for your time and meant something the council could not have translated even if they had thought to try. Not goodbye. Not a concession. A starting gun.